Thanks, Janice, for that nice introduction. It saves me the trouble of trying to sum up Karl's very impressive career and the many, many publications that he's written for. I think we have an interesting topic today, particularly because Karl has spent much of his career writing nonfiction and has recently, I guess since 2006, in the last 5 years or so, started writing fiction more seriously. Why don't you start off, since we are in Hong Kong, by talking a little bit about what brought you to Hong Kong the first time, and particularly about the book that you did on SARS, and then we can talk a bit about nonfiction and then move into the fiction side.
Sure. Thanks so much, all of you, for turning up. It's very encouraging, and thanks for inviting me. The book fair is really a sort of mind-boggling event in terms of the scale of it, and it's wonderful to see. I moved to Hong Kong in 2000, and that's where I first met Mark. And at that time, I was coming here to be the deputy editor of Time Magazine's Asian edition, which then, like so many publications, was a much more robust and thriving venture. Soon after that, I became the editor of Time Asia, and I lived here until 2004. And it's quite striking to come back now and see how much Hong Kong has changed from when I left. I really left when Hong Kong was just recovering from so many parallel problems. The economy had been struggling. SARS had been really brutal for the SAR, and for me, it's gratifying to come back and see sort of Hong Kong thriving to this extent. It feels it's very comforting. But so I came to be the editor of a magazine. And while I was here, the great sort of viral epidemic broke out, and that was really my that book in some ways is like a little bit of a tribute to Hong Kong, in that it's really about Hong Kong standing up for itself, and the sort of how this city at that time, if you guys were here, you remember how it felt really like a city under siege. And how when the streets were abandoned, when what's his name, Leslie Young, leapt to his death, we were so down, and it was such a sad time. And one of the things I wanted to write about was that feeling of what a city is like when it's in the throes of that kind of panic. And so that was really my first Hong Kong book, and Bright Boys is also very much a Hong Kong book, but again told with a very different slant, and this is where we get a little bit to fiction versus nonfiction. If that's where we're going, one of the things I'm always interested in is and one of the things that I think we were going to talk about today was this idea of how do we tell our stories, and what mediums do we use to tell our stories. And if you're like me, and you, for better or for worse, became a writer, you really have, I guess, there's three choices. There's fiction, there's nonfiction, and there's poetry. I don't have the gift of verse, so I have to rule that one out. And I spent most of my life telling my stories through nonfiction and memoir. And for a number of reasons, I think I became interested in exploring and trying to tell sort of big stories, through another medium, and that was fiction. And I think all of us who write, we all start with what's in our heads, essentially. We start with the experiences we have, what we've seen, what we've learned, who we know. And then if we're doing journalism or nonfiction, we try to structure that and build that into a story that sort of coheres roughly in our minds and out in the world with some version of what we think happened or what we believe happened. And obviously, when you're writing fiction, you take those, I think, or at least I do, I take those same events and I take those same facts and that same information and then use it to tell a story that doesn't cohere with anything that's out in the world, that is made up, but that I think tells some greater truth or some larger truth than I could have told had I just taken those events and structured them as they chronologically happened, or as I believe they really happened. So you can start out and try to tell your story any number of ways. How you do it and where you get to is really up to two things, I think. One, it's up to you as the writer to decide what best suits your information, your data, what best suits your story in a sense. And for men, I wrote one, the SARS book is an example of where I had to tell this as a nonfiction account. I mean, this really happened. This was a huge disease outbreak that brought Hong Kong to its knees. It exposed terrible corruption in China. It was a medical thriller. It was like the Andromeda strain, only it was really happening. It was happening in modern China in this rapidly evolving society. So I thought this is a book that has to be told journalistically, non-fictionally. Could that same information have been used for a novel? Certainly. I mean, that could have been done, and maybe it would have in some ways been better and more exciting. Yet the events demanded a certain loyalty to what actually happened, because real people went through it and so forth. So I think you look at the material you have, and then you make a decision whether you want to use it as fiction, use it as nonfiction. Now, the other real factor that's going to come into play as you're trying to decide what to write is what does the world want to read? It's a lot easier to get there's a lot more venues to publish your nonfiction and your journalism than there is to publish your fiction. So that's another choice one has to make. If I can tell my story as fiction or nonfiction, but if I want to get it published and if I want to have a readership, then perhaps the best thing to do is to write it as fiction. So.
Well, let me stop you there. Let me just play at being devil's advocate. I spent most of my life in nonfiction, in journalism. The stuff that you've written about, the stuff you've witnessed, I think your first book was Standard Deviations, about your time, second book about your time in Japan. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, you've lived through Asia at an extraordinary time, and you've experienced some pretty incredible things firsthand. Why bother with fiction? It's harder to sell it. The audience is smaller. It doesn't seem, I would say, as a nonfiction person, as real in a certain sense.
I think I originally to go back and sort of how I became a writer in the very beginning, because this ties into Mark's very good point. After I graduated college, I moved back to Japan, I was born in Japan. And grew up in the United States and went to college in New York. And then when I graduated, I moved back to Tokyo and got a job in an English language newspaper. I had this vague idea that I wanted to be a writer. I had this idea that I wanted to do something with the written word. But I think what that could have been was any number of avenues. If I'd somehow gotten a job working gone to a creative writing program, gone to a graduate school, that would have been one path I could have taken. Had I moved back to California and become more interested in television writing, that was another path I could have taken. I think no matter what, I had this idea that I wanted to be a writer, and it was just a matter of being lucky or unlucky enough to end up starting at this very small afternoon newspaper in Tokyo. And so, and this was I don't know if they still are. There used to be 4 English language dailies in Tokyo. This was in the late 80s or early 90s. So it was a very easy place to get hired as a reporter. And so it was almost by serendipity that I ended up writing journalism and end up sort of beginning to go into journalism, because it's sort of this is where I happen to get a job and I happen to go forward. And so the first idea of writing and publishing my writing happens to be in journalism. So I go from there to writing for writing for other magazines, writing for bigger magazines and so forth. So I kind of have to teach myself at each stage, but it's almost a matter of where one ends up that sort of dictates the form one takes. So as I began to become more ambitious about the storytelling I was doing, and as I began to want to tell bigger stories and more complicated stories, especially at that time in Tokyo, there was this amazing youth culture that was kind of going on that I was sort of seeing firsthand. I was a pretty young kid, and I was exposed to sort of a wide range of different subcultures. So I was very fortunate in that I was seeing this interesting part of society that wasn't really being written about by anyone else. So I had this idea that I'm going to write these stories. I'm going to write these stories of Japanese kids and what they're doing. And so I began to write sort of pretty big, broad, complicated narratives about these people. and going pretty close, and in some ways, you know, tipping over sometimes into using very fictional methods to tell my stories. And this is where you get into the realm of like creative nonfiction or literary journalism. And so I had no real training as a journalist, but I like to use these sort of very creative techniques in terms of telling stories. And this is verging very close to using, you know, to being fiction. It's using real people, but creating fictional, almost creating fictional, using fictional elements to bring real people to life in a way that isn't straight journalism that I would have done at Time magazine, for example. So
it was very much in the tradition, I think you've said, of Hunter Thompson or Tom Wolfe, the kind of stuff they were doing in the 60s, where it was what I guess you call almost participatory journalism.
Yeah. I mean, it's participatory. It's narrative. It's taking certain liberties in terms of recreating scenes that I don't necessarily witness. But someone tells you, describe something, and instead of you sort of go in and give the whole richness of the scene as if you're witnessing it, but that's not necessarily the case. It's sort of reconstructing things. These are techniques that are pretty common in nonfiction books, in literary journalism books, but which in sort of daily newspapers, at Time magazine, or at Business Week, you can't do that stuff. You're not supposed to do that stuff. So I was sort of experimenting and trying to do this kind of ambitious literary journalism, what I thought was ambitious literary journalism, pretty early, and already getting kind of close to this idea that I'm kind of constrained by the facts of what happened here. I'm kind of, as long as I'm going to have to write with this set of data points, I'm not going to be able to tell this kind of big emotional story that I want to tell. And so you start pushing up against that as a writer. If you're writing your own memoir, if you're writing your own story, you get to a point in your writing it where you're like, I wish this had happened then. I wish, here are the 4 important things that happened in my life. And wouldn't my life have been so much more interesting, or wouldn't this book be so much more interesting if all those things happened in 1 month instead of over 25 years, right? And one of the, and I think this is, and there's a lot of debate in memoirs. Is it okay to just make it all happen in 1 month? Is it okay to sort of compress time or expand time, to change the chronology of events so that the story seems to have more impact? Or you can even cheat, not say when things happened, or change the order of things around. Say that this event happened actually before that other event. It's still strictly true. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. They all happened, but by changing the order of events, you fundamentally change the emotional power of the story. So all this is like sort of, and I wrote in all these forms. I wrote literary journalism. I wrote straight nonfiction. I wrote personal memoir, and I began bouncing against sort of the limits of that form. And I think anyone who writes or anyone who tries to tell a story, when we've all done this, you tell a story in a bar, or you tell a story at a party, you tell a story to a friend, and we know this for a fact. Every time you access that story, every time you access your own memory, you're actually altering your memory, right? Your memory is not this sort of nugget that sits inside your head somewhere that every time you go in and look for it, here's the nugget of memory. It's actually just sort of these neurons firing, and every time you access that memory, that pattern of neurons actually changes. So your memory is actually changing every time you're accessing it. So we're in a very slippery, it's very slippery terrain here. So, in theory, you could just keep going along those directions and get to the point where there's no absolute truth, which I don't believe. I believe there is, for the purpose of the journalism, there has to be an absolute verifiable truth. But in terms of storytelling, if that's your goal, if your goal is to entertain people and to try to write stories that have a certain emotional power, not necessarily a journalistic, not necessarily a journalistic mission, then you very quickly start to break apart and reassemble the facts of your life. You break apart and reassemble the story of your life each time you're telling it and each time you're accessing it. So I think this is sort of a very long and arcing way to get to the point where I realized that I needed, in order to tell stories the way I wanted to tell stories, I was beginning to leave nonfiction and go into fiction.
I think this is a good time to take a bit of a break, and why don't you read from one of your stories?
Sure. And this is interesting. I'm going to read the beginning of the first story in Bright Boys, which is I came to Hong Kong, and my circumstances are in some ways very similar to the narrator of the story, in that I was the expat boss, so to speak, sent from overseas to work in Hong Kong. And this character in this story is that. And then you'll see sort of where I or you can guess where the reality diverges from the fiction. Silver. We were bloated. Here in Hong Kong, we had 9 floors full of staff. I had been sent from New York to run 2 of these floors, our regional marketing and sales departments. We had 70 employees in Hong Kong and dozens more spread through the region. We were like a big, slow-moving housefly that had lived long past the summer. We were too heavy to stay aloft for long, and as soon as we landed, swat, we'd be dead. But how long would it take? The conglomerate had hundreds of divisions, thousands of projects, tens of thousands of employees. It could take them years to figure out why we were even out here, in this remote outpost. Back in New York, they were busy digesting a massive merger, what the press had called a transformative transaction that would, within just a few months, become known as the worst corporate marriage in history. In Hong Kong, you could see the fat, the extraneous employees and duplicated departments, 5 payroll divisions, 6 HRs, a dozen IT help desks. And in this distant tale of the lumbering beast, far from the nerve centers, we had kept on hiring long after the string of good quarters had ended. The orders to freeze hadn't made it down the chains of command, so plans conceived during the boom were still in effect. New marketing teams, sales office in Seoul, Bangalore, and KL, a VP in Japan. We filled every position. I had the best job of all. The expat boss, sent from overseas, generously accommodated with a housing allowance, club memberships, a Teutonic sedan, and a cost of living stipend. I was 32, unmarried, and I suddenly found myself living a life of affluence. I had enough money to walk into any of the fancy boutiques in Pacific Place and choose whatever suit or pair of shoes I desired. If I had more time, I would have taken up an expensive hobby, like sailing, or collecting modern Chinese art, but instead, at first, I was too busy hiring. Our local staff greeted me warily. I've noticed that the first impression I give is often of arrogance or disdain, when actually I'm diffident. This misperception has served me well in the corporate environment. It worked in New York when I joined the company straight out of business school. I completed my tasks proficiently, managed a few insignificant projects, and was lumped in with a group of colleagues who were given credit for a successful, albeit minor, acquisition. I caught the eye of our leader, the man who would later orchestrate the disastrous merger, and rumors spread that I enjoyed a close friendship with him. Those rumors were unfounded, but their existence was enough to ensure that I was handled with great delicacy by my management team. So it was a surprise and relief for my immediate superiors in New York when I took the position in Hong Kong. It was not seen as a wise move. Those who wanted to get ahead would stay in New York, as close as possible to our 6th Avenue headquarters. Once you left, my colleagues worried, you couldn't control what people were saying about you. They were right, but I didn't care. I had gone through college in my 20s without making many friends. I didn't know by the time you hit 30, you had all the friends you were going to get. I had miscalculated. I thought maybe in Hong Kong I could catch up. I left a girlfriend behind in New York. Courtney was blonde with short hair and a pleasing gap in her lower front teeth that you saw when she smiled. She was pretty and smart, from a good family with property in Connecticut and Cape Cod. She co-produced television shows with a partner, a slightly older gay man. When I told her I had accepted a job in Hong Kong, she was shocked. I had never even mentioned the position to her before, and now I was telling her that I was moving to China. I had assumed we would have one of those long-distance relationships, phone sex, dirty emails, twice-annual rendezvous in exotic places like Bali or Kauai. That's not a relationship, she pointed out. I emailed her several times after I arrived in Hong Kong, and she never replied. When I called to ask if she was breaking up with me, she explained that we had already broken up before I left. Somehow I'd missed that.
If I can tell you all how this ends. In fact, the narrator ends up staying in Hong Kong. You, however, eventually went back to the States. You're living in California, Southern California, where I believe you grew up. But you mostly write about Asia, and mostly you write about people who are not successful expat bosses, but people who are on the end, on the outside, on the edge.
That's not indicative. Lest you think that I'm sort of some kind of closet white imperialist. I don't. This is actually I think he's the most successful person in the book, maybe. But most of the characters are Asian. In fact, all the characters in Bright Boys are Asian, except for I think 2 of the protagonists. And sort of like Speed Tribes or Standard Deviations, the stories tend to be a little bit focused on sort of the underclass or underdog or overlooked in society and in culture. And I think that's every character kind of goes into in each story, discovers something essential about themselves that they either never knew about or had lost track of. And to me, that's like a big part of what's fun about writing short stories versus writing fiction instead of journalism, is that you can have that kind of epiphany or that kind of awakening happen. Whereas when you do that in journalism, you almost feel like you're cheating, even though we do it all the time. Every time we do a profile of like a CEO or athlete or actor or whatever, we always act like they have this great awareness, or they just learned something, or they're changing, or can they handle this or can they handle that? Whereas very often this is just something that the journalist is imposing on the situation, and it's no more true than me sitting here before you and acting as if this is a crucial nexus point in my life. Sorry, but it isn't. But and I think in fiction you can do whatever you want in terms of people changing or learning or growing or becoming something. And for me, the most interesting thing in a story is for somebody who maybe, like this character, who is a little bit unfeeling or a little bit unaware or a little bit sort of disconnected from a certain emotional stream of life or a certain sort of humanity, to kind of come to terms with that and realize that he has these feelings and that he has these needs. It's sort of an awakening thing. To me, that's one of the most fun things you can do in a story, is play with ideas like that. But yeah, lest you think that this is a book about colonialism, it very much isn't.
You're living in the States. You were born in Japan. I think one of your parents was American and one was Japanese. You're writing almost exclusively about Asia. Will that remain the same? You'll stay in California, keep writing about Asia?
No. I mean, I think my last book was a memoir about my younger brother who's autistic. My younger brother Noah's autistic, so I wrote a memoir about him, which was one of the big elements of that book is actually fictional, and it's probably the first place that I ever published fiction, or it may well have been, or the first book of fiction. But so that book wasn't about Asia. It was a book about my life and my life with my brother. My younger brother Noah is profoundly autistic, and my father had written several books about him, and so I because of the prevalence of autism, and especially in the United States and around the world now, I took up that subject. But in terms of writing about Asia, it's once you've lived here long enough, as you know, and once you've written enough about it, whenever anything happens in Japan or China, I mean, they still want to send you here. I mean, the Japanese earthquake was people kept asking me to go to Japan and cover that. The 6 reactors melting down, and that wasn't a story I was really interested in jumping on. No matter how much money they want to pay you, there's certain stories you don't want to do. But I think I'll always be, I always have to come back a couple times a year for work.
Let me rephrase that. your book on autism is something I've only read in excerpt. It's, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a beautifully written, very, very poignant book, and it is, of course, about the States. I was thinking particularly of your fiction. Your fiction always seems to be set here, and is set primarily among the people who are living at the margins of society. Do you think that's going to remain your focus?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this book is being published here, right now. It just comes out sort of today. But the book I have coming out in the U.S. in a few months, which has elements of this, is actually, it's almost like this book, but about the United States. I mean, that's the funny thing, I've noticed something in my life, which is when I lived in Japan. When I first got to Japan, I was writing a lot about New York, which was the last place I'd lived before I went to Japan. Then when I moved from Japan back to California, and I lived in California briefly before moving back to New York, I found myself writing almost exclusively about Japan. And then in the same way, when I left Hong Kong and moved back to New York in 2004, I found myself writing for a couple of years almost exclusively about like Hong Kong and China. And so that's sort of where these stories are from.
So you need the distance geographically, or
I think we do. I think we always need. I think we have trouble getting perspective on whatever our subject is. And I think as journalists, especially if you worked at a daily newspaper or a weekly, you don't have that luxury of gaining perspective so much time. Sometimes you do, and those are probably the better stories that we ever do. Are stories where we do have time to actually figure out what we're thinking about it. But very often, if you're just covering the news, you don't have time to even figure out what you're thinking. You're just having to cover it. And I think with memoir and with fiction and with any sort of personal writing like that, you have to have a little bit of distance to even understand what happened, to even understand which events and which moments and which conversations and who mattered at that time. I mean, it's sort of like the difference between writing about a relationship while you're in it versus writing about a relationship after it's over. It's just completely, you're going to have two completely different versions of events. And so I think one of the reasons that there was sort of this, I had this long period where I was writing about Asia constantly was as I was living in New York, I just was sort of, that was the experience that was coming into focus for me. And then it's funny, since we moved from Tribeca to L.A. About a year and a half ago, and then I sort of began to go into this intensive period of writing about New York, and that's sort of what my next book is going to be. And so I think there is a natural tendency to try to catch up with yourself, and the way you catch up with yourself is by sort of revisiting that last period. If you're someone who's moved around, and I suspect even if you've been in one place geographically, you still are writing about the last period of your life. I mean, maybe that's the reason presidential memoirs come out after the person's left office, because I think you can't. While you're going through something, I don't think while I'm going through something, I don't think I understand it. I don't think I understand the importance or seriousness or levity or any of the sort of the defining attributes of that time. And so I have to give it a little bit of distance. There are people maybe who don't have to do that, but I think it's a very different experience. I think if you're not doing that, then that's journalism. I think that's what journalism is, maybe.
Let me sort of ask you a slightly, I guess, somewhat more mechanical question. You're managing to balance or juggle nonfiction journalism and fiction at the same time, and it seems that you're writing fiction about sort of the last place you were, as it were. Are you doing these things on the same day, the same week? I mean, what does your day or your week or your month look like? You're doing stories for Bloomberg Business Week now, and yet you're publishing fiction.
These are what's that expression? These are the dogs I sell to feed my cats. I mean, that's what journalism is, feels like to me sometimes. It's actually the wonderful thing about journalism is that a couple of things happen. One, my journalism has become much more staid over sort of the last 10 years. In fact, the liberties I took when I was a younger writer in terms of narrative nonfiction and literary journalism, that may well have been breaking certain rules or certain ideas of journalism that many people hold sacred, understandably. And so I sort of had a come to the mountain moment where I realized I'm not going to do that anymore, or I can't do that anymore. And for another thing is that's really hard to do over and over again. If every magazine article you write is like this, essentially like a short story, and having to have those sort of narrative elements, you're really setting a pretty high bar for yourself, and it's very difficult. And so really when I got a job at Time, I began working at Time in 1998. From that point on, I'd say my magazine writing became, I'm sorry to say, a little more boring, a little more predictable, and I sort of from that point began the sort of shift into fiction and writing fiction, and so, until the point now where I see, if at that point I could see, my journalism as almost requiring the same creative juice as writing fiction would require, the same fuel. At this point, it's just two different tracks completely. So if I'm reporting a story for Business Week or for Time, it's a more formulaic process. I mean, if anyone here has worked as a reporter, we all know the process. You want to talk to people, get access, as much access as you can, and get sort of as many takes with that person as you can, so you can kind of build a story out of it. And that process to me is a little bit more mechanical feeling than trying to write fiction, or trying to write a novel, or trying to write a short story. Because I'd say the range of possibility isn't nearly as wide. You go into it and knowing, well, for one thing, you go into it knowing how long it should be. You don't ever start, or you very rarely start a piece of fiction saying this has to be, 600 lines would be like a time length, or 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 words would be like a magazine length. You never go into or you shouldn't go into a piece of real writing where your soul is invested thinking it's going to be this length or that length. That's just a very artificial and limiting process. Whereas you do that with journalism, that's the definition of it, is you always go in knowing what you're shooting for. So I think the processes are so different that for me, if sometimes I can do both in the same day. It's a long and it's a pretty tough day, because if I'm writing journalism, if I'm doing a magazine article, if once the reporting's done, I try to write about 1,000 words a day, and that's like a good professional pace for me. And if I do that, I can have a pretty long feature story done in like 5 days. That's 5,000 words. That's a really long story nowadays. And if I'm writing fiction, I really don't like to write more than 500 words a day, because whereas I think that's really all the good stuff I have to say on any given day. And the other thing is, I like to always know the next thing that I want to write in the story. So it's almost accessing different parts of your brain at this point, for me. But that's not to say that there's days when I'm terrible at one, or days I'm terrible at both. I mean, it's always a crapshoot what you're going to get.
Do you start out your stories knowing where they're going to end?
Like a magazine article, or no? No, I never went to an MFA program. I mean, those are very popular now in the U.S. Almost every writer of literary fiction or who's publishing short stories in the magazines, I mean, everyone comes out of an MFA program now. And I'm just old enough that I sort of became a writer when you could, when everyone thought there were many different ways to become a writer. You could go to graduate school, or you could, become a journalist and then become a novelist, or you could do that. I mean, it seems like now there's like journalists over here, and that's one track that's sort of gradually moving toward everyone working for Bloomberg or something. And then there's like another track of people who go to graduate school and become like literary fiction writers, and they don't really intertwine. And I don't know any other magazine writers who are writing fiction anymore. I mean, it used to be quite common in the 70s and 80s. It was a very common thing. So I think one of the things that if you go through an MFA program, you have a little bit more of a template about sort of the process of writing short stories or whatever it is. And I never really had that, but I think there's many different ways to do it. And if you talk to commercial writers, they do have templates.
But you personally write your 500 words, and your story takes, unfolds as you write it.
Yeah, but sometimes I have to go back and sometimes you realize that the 500 you wrote that day, that was really the beginning of the story.
Sure, but you don't know where it's going to end when you write those
no.
first 500 words.
No, very, very seldom. I mean, usually you start a story with it's like, in a weird way, that's the one thing that's similar to like a magazine article. Like if with a magazine article, you do have one sort of moment with somebody that sticks in your head as being a good moment for the story, and starting out, I got to get that moment in there. With a short story or with a novel, whatever, sometimes you start just with like an image or a scene from your life. Like that story I just read, Silver, what that story really ends up being about is the boss joining the company soccer team, and it's the first time, that sort of the big boss had ever joined the company soccer team, and it was sort of based on, and that was something that I did, right? I moved to Hong Kong and joined what was then the Time Warner Asia soccer team, and so I had this idea of trying, and something really tragic did happen on the team. I mean, that's the funny thing, yeah. And so I had this thing, and I thought, well, and there were two ways. I could have written it as nonfiction. I could have written it as memoir, but then when I began writing it, it just kind of came that way. It kind of came out as fiction, and then I think you sort of you have that scene or that idea in your head, and you're going to get there one way or another, and sometimes that idea ends up, the irony of it is that sometimes that scene or that idea ends up not even being in the final story. I mean, that's the amazing thing about it. The driving idea ends up being discarded along the way because it doesn't fit with what you've kind of been doing.
Any special influences in terms of authors, people who have really impressed you, or people that you hate? I'm thinking fiction in particular.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about Ma Jian, and because I think we were talking about him yesterday, or some people were talking, and I mean, the Red Dust was right? That was the big Ma Jian. You all know him. He's like the great sort of memoirist, travel writer. Ma Yan, I guess, right? Is that how it's pronounced? Ma Jian, yeah. And that book, Red Dust, was a really powerful read to me because it's a story of essentially him traveling through China, and is it the late 80s? I feel like it's the late, yeah. And it's not, and there isn't a political thought expressed in the whole book, yet the sum of it somehow becomes this very powerful statement about the individual in China. And to me, that book is I love that as an Asian book. I love that book because it does everything. It sort of exposes all the ideas in this society, talks about everything that's going on in the culture, and it's nonfiction, right? I mean, at least nominally, it's nonfiction. But I like that kind of writer who and I guess he's a bit like, that's a bit like Kapuscinski or those kind of writers, the sort of writers who kind of go in between fiction and nonfiction, and at some point you're reading the book, you start out thinking it's nonfiction, and then you just forget entirely what it is because you're just swept up in this narrative, and I mean that's the kind of writer who, I think when I was younger, I really looked up to. Which were these writers who were sort of doing these kind of, like William Vollmann, a guy who's doing these books. You don't know whether they're fiction or nonfiction. They're just these kind of amazing, big and weird stories. And I think now, one of the things I'm doing is I'm judging the LA Times book prizes for fiction and for novels and for first fiction. So I'm reading a lot of novels, and I find myself being more and more drawn to, this is just where I'm going now, is I'm sort of drawn to kind of historical fiction now, because I admire the sort of the way a good, like a historical novelist will pull details, pull those details out of Google and sort of put them into into a narrative. I mean, Google makes everything so. It's amazing how the internet has made doing historical fiction just a lot easier, because you can now get all the information you want. Like, you used to have to go to the library to find out, what kind of pipes people smoked in the 19th century in London, and now it's just all there. It's astonishing. I mean, I think that's but to me, what I admire is people who do that sort of seamlessly. I mean, that's always fun.
It's coincidental, but you happen to live in the same town where Henry Miller spent the last decade or so of his life, and it strikes me there are certain parallels between his time in Paris in the 20s and 30s working for an English language newspaper and sort of living a bit on the edge, and you in Tokyo in the 90s.
I wouldn't presume any equivalence at all. But Henry Miller is a great example of somebody Henry Miller was an American writer who sort of was discovered kind of late in his life. He lived in Paris in the 30s, but it was like in his 40s before anyone even knew who he was.
Well, his books were banned in the States until the 1960s on obscenity.
But a book like Tropic of Cancer, which was his first sort of big book, which was, I think, published as a novel.
1934.
Yeah, but it really read like a non-fictional memoir. And today, I would bet that a book like Tropic of Cancer would be published as memoir, because commercially it would be more viable to publish that as memoir rather than as a novel. But yeah, I mean that was an amazing. That's an example of that shifting standard that I was talking about. But yeah, Miller lived in Pacific Palisades, but there's I feel no kinship with him other than being an admirer.
We have, I think, about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'd like to open it up to questions if anybody would like to ask Karl anything. Yeah, please.
You know how Hong Kong people got a love-hate relation with Japan, because we love Japanese culture and American culture, but somehow capitalism and imperialism and the long history of Hong Kong and Japan and in America really makes us feel this is a unique city as you have lived in before. And actually, I would really love to have you write something about the Japanese earthquake that you're not interested in, because I think what you write will be very poignant and moving, and I hope you will consider that. And also, I'd like to know that Bright Boys or whatever would be your best novel that you like. Which is the novel you like best that you wrote?
I think I was most pleased with China Syndrome, with the Hong Kong books, because I thought it did the most and sort of it was the most complicated story, and I thought I executed it as well as I could with that material.
Was your question about not fiction particularly, or any of his writing?
Any of his writing.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, Bright Boys, I think, is not the best thing I've done until now. Certainly, just as a piece of writing, because I think I'm still at the age where I think I'm getting better as I get older. At some point, I think writers begin they deteriorate. Sort of, yeah, I think so. I think in the 70s and 80s, it's sort of it's a rare writer who does his best stuff like once he's past kind of 60. It seems like, right? I mean, there are some who keep going. Philip Roth is still going, but most by the time you hit 60, you've pretty much written your best book. It seems like.
Is Philip Roth still getting better?
I don't know if he's getting better, but he had an amazing run after he hit 70, like with Operation Shylock and Sabbath Theater. And I mean, but that's the exception. I mean, most writers sort of, if mathematicians peak in their like 20s or early 20s, I think writers sort of 40s and 50s are kind of probably when you have the combination of like you still have some energy and power but you've also sort of wizened to have like more control and better diction and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of Japan and Hong Kong and China and sort of the history of animosity that sometimes can cloud relationships, it's funny. I felt, even though I'm half Japanese and was born there, I always felt an outsider in Japan, just because just like I always sort of feel like an outsider in the U.S. and I always felt like an outsider in Hong Kong. So for me, I've always found an equivalence of experience in each place. So when people, especially on the mainland, Hong Kong isn't like that, but on the mainland, when there's sort of this angry, occasionally, whenever anything happens in the world, it seems like there's a big demonstration against Japan. You know, it's sort of one of these regular sort of whipping boys in terms of it's very tolerated sometimes in China to have protests against Japan, and not that Japan doesn't deserve it and so forth, but I sort of don't relate to being mad at an entire country or being mad at an entire people. It just doesn't make sense to me, and it never has, and I think maybe that's because I've always felt at odds, you know, in all the places I've lived. I've never really been an insider so much.
Sorry, next question. I've got a couple other questions here. Want to stand up? Here's a mic.
That's fine. I'll just ask.
I think they need it for the video.
Okay. Hello. You mentioned at the start of your career how you had several options and several paths to take. And I was wondering what your opinion is on all these new academic programs, whether it's an MFA or a journalism degree. Do you feel like they force writers into a genre too early, or do you think they're a good thing?
I think I think about that sometimes, that if I could have gone to an MFA program, would I have? You know, I mean, fortunately, I had such bad grades in college that it wasn't really an option for me. But if I do think, well, if I had done that, how would my life have been different? One of the good things about becoming a journalist, and not necessarily going to journalism school, but getting a job and working in especially in a place like Japan or Hong Kong, where you're sort of exposed to a diversity of experiences and backgrounds, is that you're constantly meeting new people and meeting people from different walks of life and meeting people who otherwise you wouldn't have seen or interacted with. And that's a great gift if you're going to go on to write anything, because you're gathering this diversity of experience and character that you're going to use later. So for me, being a journalist is how I met people. I'm very shy, and I tend to be a little bit introverted. So journalism forces me to come and talk to people and to interact with people and to try to have that dialogue. Other people maybe don't need that. I suppose if you're very extroverted and you're good at striking up conversations with just whoever, then you can gather all that experience without the sort of the cover of being a reporter. I think as a writer, it's like what you're going to become is kind of just up to you. I mean, that's on the individual, and it's in this whole idea of finding your voice or whatever, which is a big idea that everyone talks about. Now you have to find your voice, right? I think if you're going to do that, if you're going to become a writer, or if you're going to write fiction or whatever, it's just going to happen whether you go to graduate school or you don't go to graduate school. Now, is it going to be easier to make a living if you go to graduate school? Maybe, because you can become a teacher and you can do all that stuff. Now, is it easier to make a living, or it used to be easier to make a living as a journalist, because there are all these magazines that would pay you to do stuff, and maybe that's coming to an end, so that's different. But so I think there's two different issues here. There's making a living, and there's the art or craft of what you're doing, and those things don't always overlap. And that's just how life is. But it's like that in any creative field. There's the stuff you do, like there's your work, and then there's how you feed yourself. And there's a lot of different solutions to that. Maybe a solution is to go to graduate school.
Next, yeah.
Thank you. And my question is regarding how to find stories, because sometimes I really feel that nowadays there's not too many stories to tell, and friends getting together, but mainly they are gossip, but not many stories that they think they can really write a book. And also, for you, what is the main element that has motivated you to inspire you to write a book? Is it from your experience from living in different cities, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and California, or is it because the culture that's been the strong motivation? Thank you.
Motivation's a strange concept, and because sometimes someone will tell me to write something, or an editor will tell me to write something, assign a story that I have no interest in, and this is as a magazine article, and it'll end up being like the best thing the best thing I write that year is a story that before I was told to write it, I would never have been interested in it. And then sometimes there's something that I really want to write that I'm sure is just going to be great, and I convince someone to let me do it, and I go do it, and it just is terrible. So that's a little bit of a it's a disconcerting idea to realize that you're not always the world's greatest expert on yourself, because we sort of go through life assuming that we are. And
I would say, or sometimes you think it's great, or everybody likes it at first, and 5 years later it's lousy, and vice versa. I mean,
I've never had that happen to me.
They always just get better with time, right?
Yeah, at every version of the game. So sort of the idea of it's funny because that means the idea of inspiration is like fundamentally flawed sometimes, which can be alarming because as a writer you're depending on that as one of the indicators that you should do something or not. Yet you realize, well, it's not always reliable. But you know what? You still have to depend on it. You still have to trust that instinct or that inspiration that tells you something's a good story. And that's, I think the same thing applies with fiction in that there are times when where that's roughly happened, where there's something that I think is really great and really compelling, an incident or something that happened to me. I think this is going to be really good, and then the story just doesn't work. And there's other stuff which seems almost like academic in terms of how I'm approaching it, and that ends up being a better story. And it is funny when someone has told me, I was having lunch with an editor actually an editor of the Paris Review, who said he was looking for a story kind of like this, and he described the story, sort of everything. He felt like everything was kind of this. He was getting all this academic MFA program writing, and it wasn't really wasn't really working. And so he said he would love the story, and he sort of gave this idea of a story. And being the sort of resourceful, enterprising freelancer that I am, I went back to my office and just began writing the story to fit this idea of a story that he had. This is Philip Gurevich, who's the editor of the Paris Review at the time, and that ended up being one of the best. That ended up being a really good story, and it was something that before I had that lunch, I had never even really thought of it. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's everybody's different, and everybody gets their ideas, and everyone gets everyone's motivated by something different, and sometimes the best motivation to do something is money. I mean, that always works too,
and
right?
It's always been true. I mean, you guys are laughing, but I mean, writers have always written for money, and for the last 150 years, writers have been able to make a living, which before that, only gentlemen could afford to, or women could afford to write. It does tend to focus the mind when you have to worry about the next paycheck. If I could also sort of try to answer your question about stories, I think Karl's previous answer about getting a platform, whether it's working as a journalist, which, as he said, is a wonderful platform that allows you to intrude in people's lives, gives you a license to talk to people, no matter how shy and introverted you are. It forces you to go do that. But you could have ended up at an ad agency. Think of Mad Men or something. You probably would have turned to fiction earlier. I think journalism is a better platform personally, but I spent most of my life in it. There are a lot of stories out there. I mean, you can't make up what's going on in Hong Kong, let alone in China right now, in Asia. I mean, the changes we're going through here are more extraordinary than almost anywhere in the world, and there are historical shifts, and just get out there and find some way of getting engaged, and the stories will almost write themselves. You still got to then have the discipline and the motivation to do it, which I'm not really sure you answered the question about why you do it. It's not for the money. Maybe it's for the glory of
ego, money. I mean, it's always tied in. The main reason. The main reason I write most days is because I just feel bad if I don't. It's not like I feel so good if I write something, if I write my 500 words. It's just I feel bad if I don't. At the end of the day, I don't feel like I've done anything. And this was one of the reasons I didn't like being an editor. It's interesting, when I was editing Time, I could, we could close the magazine on a Saturday, and I don't know how much work I was doing. It's a long day when you're closing, when you're closing a weekly, especially because the time difference here in New York and all that. But at the end of the day, I didn't feel like I'd done anything. But I'd done, I'd done a ton of stuff. I'd edited 3 stories, and I'd, come up with the cover lines and did all this stuff. But I didn't feel like, it didn't feel the same to me as if I'd just written that day. And that's, I think, one of the reasons I stopped being an editor was that realization that I have to do what at the end of the day, but what allows me to sleep at night. And so that was, that I think that's what it is. So if you can go, if you don't have to write, then you're not going to write. That's pretty much it. And if you have to, you will. And life will tell you that one way or another. I mean, it's like making a living as a writer and being a writer. I mean, it's kind of hard enough that if you can do anything else, you'll probably do it. If I were good at anything else, I think I may have ended up doing that. Because this is pretty hard, and it just keeps going and going and going. It's not like it ever gets easier. It's pretty much just as hard now as it is kind of when I began. It's just the same process. It's not like you break through and then suddenly the writing gets easier. It's still every day facing the same screen, and having and each day that experience is just it's very repetitive if you think about it. And then also just the physical posture of just sitting there, in front of your computer. I mean, so if it's like but I guess everyone does that in every office job now, so it's not that different, right? It used to be when we were typing, it was like really. Writers are the only ones who are just sitting there typing all the time, but now everyone's sitting around typing. Yeah, so you might as well, you might as well be a writer, I guess. It's either that or looking at porn or whatever else everyone's always doing, sitting in front of their computer. But I mean, I think it's just a matter of if life will tell you what you're going to do.
But it does get habit forming, and that's, again, getting back to the earlier questions. If you do journalism or you do something that forces you to write every day, again, then it seems weird the days you don't. But it's hard because you gotta create something from nothing. It's not like you're just fooling around with an Excel spreadsheet and changing the figures. You got to make it up, and it's got to come out of your head. So anyway, question here. Yeah.
Thank you, Karl. I heard you say that. You have a brother who is autistic, and you wrote a book about your brother. But you also said that your dad had already written 2 books about him. 3. Oh, okay. My question is, one, is your dad also a writer, and is that why you became a writer? And secondly, if he's written 3 books already, why did you also write a book? Thank you.
Both my parents are writers. That has a lot to do, obviously, with my mother's a writer and is a very successful novelist in Japan, and my father was a screenwriter and novelist and author in America. And the books he wrote about my brother, A Child Called Noah, was the most famous one. They were really the first. A Child Called Noah was like the first big book about autism ever written. It came out in 1971. And it was my father had written a story for Life magazine about my brother, and it generated the largest reader response in the history of Life magazine at that point, which was a big deal. And those books were very much about my brother, and I was the normal brother, so I was almost like like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern or something in this. I mean, I was just a side note. I was a sideshow of the whole book. But as I got older, and then in each book, these books were diaries of my family. I mean, that's what my father was publishing, and he did 3 of those. But then as I got older, and as autism became this big national epidemic in America, there was a couple of reasons I thought that it was valuable that I add to that conversation. One, the sibling story really wasn't very much told or talked about, sort of what it's like to grow up with an autistic brother, and then the issues in the family that are around that. Because a family, when there is a sibling with one child with a disability, the family becomes very disproportionately focused on that child, and the normal siblings can almost be sort of lost in the shuffle a little bit. So I wrote a book kind of to address that. And then also, my brother is a couple of years younger than me. He's 2 years younger than me, so he's a grown man. If in America you began to get the idea that autism was like a childhood disease, that would magically go away when you know, as the kid sort of grew up and got his act together or something, you know, and you know, my book was sort of about, well, no, I mean, all these autistic kids are going to become, or many of them, especially the profoundly autistic kids, are going to become adults. And so that's sort of what my book was about, was my relationship with my brother as a child, but also as a man, and as a brother, as an adult. So that was the service and utility of the book. Is my father's books ended when Noah was 16, and so my book dealt with that childhood period, but also dealt with Noah as an adult.
A final question from anyone? Yes.
You mentioned the debate in stretching and compressing time in creative nonfiction. May I ask where you yourself draw the line in regards to the facts in creative nonfiction?
Isn't that a good question? I think the line is like an internal one. It's that you have a sense of when you are sort of trading on fabrication and when you're not. But that said, it seems like, you know, I think that the line keeps moving, and for every writer, it seems like every writer has a different idea of where that line is, and some books, you know, I guess like A Million Little Pieces was an example of where that line, everyone agreed that the line had been crossed too far, but then there's other memoirists who seem to have a different sense of where what they're allowed to get away with. So I think I don't think there's a rule out there in the world when it comes to creative nonfiction as to what is acceptable or what isn't. And I don't know who's going to formulate that. There's no committee.
It seems to change over time. I mean, I think of somebody like Bob Woodward who he reconstructs quotes. 30 years ago, people wouldn't have done that. Now it's very, very widely accepted.
I think 30 years ago, more people did that. Actually, I would say that, like, in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot more sort of license taken by journalists.
Maybe in journals, I guess. Sorry, I'm thinking of nonfiction.
I think in political books. I think in that kind of political book that Woodward's doing. I mean, yeah. I mean, there's weird stuff like. I mean, Woodward had when he after Bill Casey died, the director of the CIA died, and Woodward claimed it had been at his bedside and reconstructed this amazing confession that Casey made. I mean, there's weird stuff in books, and I think it's especially with books, it's kind of up to the writer to decide what his rules are. And then the reader, in the best case, the reader knows by the tone and by the disclaimer the writer puts on the front of the book, or that the reader knows, okay, these are the rules, and I can either accept this or not accept it.
Does the author have a duty to tell the reader that?
I think the author does, yeah. I think it has to be there, but I think the way the author can tell the reader that is varied. You know, I think there's almost a voice or a style in the writing that is almost a wink at the reader, so the reader knows. I think in A Million Little Pieces, that's one of the debates, is that if you read A Million Little Pieces, the book was self-evidently fiction. This was the James Fry book that Oprah Winfrey had, made a big to-do about, and it turned out that, huge chunks of it were completely fabricated. It's an old story, but that book was pretty self-evidently fiction. The tone of it was pretty obviously fiction, and yet, or that's what I thought. When I read it, I thought this was pretty clearly cooked, but a lot of readers didn't feel that way, and I think a lot of readers felt betrayed. So there you have an example where maybe an author wasn't clear enough about what was going on, and that's, I think that's an issue that every writer has to figure out for themselves. But if you're working at a magazine or a publication, I mean, then there are rules that publication has. But I think for me, I had to actually figure that stuff out too.
Okay, it looks like the flowers have arrived, so maybe we can call the formal part of the session to a close and thank Karl. I would highly recommend you consider purchasing some of his books. I think you can tell from the discussion Karl is a very gifted writer and has written on quite an extraordinary range of subjects, from autism to SARS to his personal memoirs to life in Japan in the late 80s, mid 90s. So please join me in giving a round of applause to Karl.